over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome to State of the Nation, daily plunge into the stories shaping our country. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Monday to Thursday we bring you the insights, the facts, the truth about how our country is being governed. Because what happens in Downing Street matters down your street. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs. That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect, and then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together, and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The Tory leadership race continues, and I will be bringing you a full-length interview with former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick. I asked him everything from the ECHR.
I have come to the conclusion that in that programme of reform, we need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights.
To what the net migration cap should be. Would your target net migration figure be if you were to be Prime Minister? To whether we should pause net zero.
Can and should decarbonise our economy over time. But we
should we? Do you really care? I'll also be revealing what I think the next Tory leader must commit to if the Tories want to win the next election. Plus, reports have suggested the Labour government will break another of its promises not to increase taxes on working people by increasing fuel duty. They just hate the motorist. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my most intellectual panel, GB News' senior political commentator Nigel Nelson and the Conservative peer and journalist Paul Goodman. As ever, I want to hear your views. It's a crucial part of the programme, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's one of your favourite parts of the day, the News Bulletin with Sophia Wensler.
Nigel, thank you. Good evening from the GB Newsroom. It's just gone 9 o'clock. Your top story this hour. The Prime Minister has confirmed a ban on outdoor smoking is being considered because of the huge burden smoking puts on the NHS and the taxpayer. According to what the Sun newspaper says are secret Whitehall papers, ministers are considering making it illegal to light up in outdoor restaurants, playgrounds and outside nightclubs and stadiums. Hospitality bosses say new restrictions would cost jobs, but Sir Keir Starmer insists action's needed.
Starting point on this is to remind everyone that over 80,000 people lose their lives every year because of smoking. That's a preventable death. It's a huge burden on the NHS, and of course it's a burden on the taxpayer. So yes, we are going to take decisions in this space. More details will be revealed, but this is a preventable series of deaths, and we've got to take the action to reduce the burden on the NHS and reduce the burden on the taxpayer.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has said he discussed resetting relations during a meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris today. Sir Keir Starmer's talks with French leaders focused on a new treaty expected to take 6 months to finalise. Illegal migration was also on the agenda as leaders aim to enhance intelligence sharing to tackle smuggling gangs. It follows news that over 20,000 migrants have crossed the English Channel into the UK this year, with hundreds arriving just yesterday. Meanwhile, Conservative leadership hopeful Tom Tugendhat has pledged to introduce a legally binding annual cap on net migration of 100,000 if he becomes leader. Delivering a speech on public services this afternoon, the former Security Minister said high levels of population growth fuelled by immigration could not continue.
The party under my leadership will commit to a legally binding annual cap on non-British annual net migration of 100,000. We cannot sustain the hundreds of thousands it is today.
In other news, a man has been jailed for physically threatening to kill former Labour leader Ed Miliband on a street in Doncaster. Michael Donaldson shouted threats at Miliband and his staff, leaving them shaken before being arrested in March. The 56-year-old, who appeared intoxicated, dismissed the incident as a joke, but later pleaded guilty. Today, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison at Sheffield Crown Court. And train driver strikes at London North Eastern Railway have been called off following last-ditch talks between union and company officials. More than 20 days of strikes were planned on weekends in the next few months after the union claimed there had been a breakdown in industrial relations. But ASLEF said strike action is now suspended and drivers will report for duty as normal. The development follows meetings between the union and the company. Those are the latest GB News headlines for now. Now, back to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. Yesterday was the day when 20,000 migrants had crossed the Channel so far this year. If we continue on this trend, we will reach another record number of crossings in 1 year. Unfortunately, with the cancellation of the Rwanda plan, as well as the legalisation of Channel crossings, there is no serious effort by this socialist government to solve the problem. And that is why, along with legal migration, dealing with the problem of illegal migration, indeed protecting and securing Britain's borders, is already becoming a fundamental issue of the Tory leadership contest. The next leader of the Conservative Party will want to do the following things if they are serious. First of all, we must obviously leave the European Court of Human Rights. The modern left loves to remind us how Winston Churchill was instrumental in its inception. This is true. However, what Churchill sought to create was an institution that protected the individual from the state. What the ECHR has come to represent is the antithesis of democracy, something by which Churchill would be appalled. Judges on the court now invent new rights for themselves that were never included in the original convention, despite a lack of democratic sanction for them. Second, the next Tory leader must leave or make ineffective in UK law the otherworldly Refugee Convention. The Refugee Convention set the definition of refugees very broadly in the aftermath of the Second World War. The founders failed to anticipate the globalised world that now exists. As the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, pointed out, the Convention effectively grants the right to come to this country, wait for it, listen very carefully, to 750 million. That's a 750 million people, more than 10 times our current population. It's time to leave this convention and set our asylum policy on democratic terms. Third, the next leader must create a deterrence for Channel crossings, as the Rwanda policy did. Without a deterrence, the problem will not end. And finally, the next Tory leader must bring an end to mass legal migration permanently. It was clear at the election that there was little appetite for Labour. The government lost the election. The opposition didn't win it. The reason we lost was because we neglected our voters, who then stayed at home or voted for Nigel Farage, which ran on a reduced migration ticket. The British people never voted for mass migration, and it's time to bring it under close control at last. These steps would represent a modest and sensible start towards rebuilding trust with the voters, whom we abandoned, before we can begin to reconstruct this country in a conservative way, with a conservative vision, unleashing our latent growth and improving the standard of living for everyone. As always, let me know your thoughts, mailmog at gbnews.com. With me now is my most intellectual panel, GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson, and the Conservative peer and journalist, Paul Goodman. Nigel, it's very interesting. Tom Tugendhat today has called for an absolute cap on legal migration of 100,000. We'll see in a moment what Jenrick has to say. This is one of the key defining issues of the Tory leadership campaign.
It does seem to be. Everyone seems to be banging on about immigration rather than anything else. I mean, some of the points you were making there, that I don't think we should leave all the international legal bodies, so I don't think we should leave ECHR. I'm disappointed you think the Refugee Convention doesn't work, and we should leave that. I mean, you didn't mention the 1967 Protocol. The original convention was really about refugees in Europe after the Second World War. In 1967, that was actually expanded to the rest of the world, and we signed up to that.
It's a good thing. It's a pious thing. It's a holy thing. But it's utterly impractical. We cannot create a right for 750 million people. It's dishonest to keep on saying that we have created that right. If they all came here, we would take it away.
Yeah, but they're not all coming here, are they?
Lots of them are trying.
So if we're talking about, as far as Britain's concerned, with people crossing the Channel, that's much smaller than France and other European countries. If we're talking about legal migration, much of that was actually designed by your lot when they were in government.
I accept that.
On things like, they wanted to fund universities, so let's have 600,000 foreign students by 2030, that kind of thing.
No, I think that turned out to be a great mistake. But Paul, let me bring you in, because you're such a close watcher of Conservative leadership elections. Is this becoming the key issue of the leadership campaigns? You were at a debate yesterday. What were the candidates saying then?
Well, there are three key issues, in my view, that any party has to sort to win. The first is economic credibility. The second is value for money in the NHS, about which, frankly, we've heard almost nothing in the Conservative leadership campaign. And the third is migration. Obviously, migration tends to come up a lot. It did come up a great deal yesterday, and we're about to have an interview, I gather, with one of the leadership candidates that we will comment upon. I would just say one thing. In the last resort, of course, the government has to act on behalf of its citizens. But I don't think any government can solve this problem alone. And other European countries appear to be as fed up with the ECHR as we are. They seem to find ways around it that we don't, something to do with the way our judiciary works and our legal system works. But I think the first thing I'd do, were I a candidate, which thank goodness for everyone I'm not, is I would be going first to the French and the Germans and seeing if we couldn't work together to reform the ECHR and make it more acceptable. If it isn't, then we may have to go.
But there seems to be no great appetite for doing that, because whenever you enter a negotiation, one side or another is going to have to take slightly more migrants. And we don't want any more, and the French don't want any more. And therefore, you never get that meeting of minds.
I don't think that's right. I don't think it's right because of the very point you were making about the convention, which is that it was formed, 50, 60 years ago, and is simply out of date. The place you have to start from is working out how many you can take, and then what you do in relation to the people who come who you can't take. And I don't see intrinsically why the European countries are in a different place on that from us. It's not just a case of shuffling the same people around.
Let's broaden it out from migration to the economy. How can the Conservatives say they're going to run the economy effectively when they want to protect every benefit whenever it's threatened by a Labour government?
Well, actually, I'd ask a broader question, which I think is a very difficult one for my party and your party to grasp, which is there's a credibility problem here. I'm not having a go at Tom Tugendhat, who, if he gets into the final, I might actually vote for. But it's pretty difficult for these Conservative leadership candidates to stand up and say they're going to control immigration, because voters are going to be asking, what were you doing for the last 14 years? And I think that's a very hard question to answer.
The credibility question. How do you build up credibility in opposition? How did Keir Starmer build up his credibility to the extent that he did?
Well, I mean, it's a matter of performance. There's things like Prime Minister's questions, being reasonable there. Also, I think that he gradually put policy together over a period of time. They didn't rush it out. I appreciate he went back on some of his 10 pledges that he'd fought the leadership
Almost all of them.
Well, not quite all, but anyway.
Almost, yeah.
Almost all. But it was a gradual development of policy. Labour were initially criticised when he took over for not having any policy. So they thought about it and then had a reasonable manifesto when they came to the general election. So I still think you're right. There is a problem of trust. There's certainly a problem of trust over taxes now coming in at the October the 30 budget. People were led to believe that there weren't going to be any. He didn't say there weren't going to be any, but that's certainly what people believe.
Yes. It's back to 1992 when the Conservative government said we had no need and no plans to raise taxes, and immediately after the election we discovered a need and developed a plan. Yeah. And that actually voters listened to the broad thrust of your argument, not the get-out-of-jail-free cards.
No, I mean, I think that Rachel Rees is right about the black hole that she discovered. I mean, another bit of it was found today.
Well, that she dug.
Well, no, I mean...
With lavish payouts to her mates in the public sector.
There were bits there that people didn't know about. I mean, the IFS has come out today with a report on the Home Office, and they were putting in budgets of 110 million to deal with asylum seekers when the actual bill came in for 3 years running at 2.6 billion. That adds to the black hole.
That's a normal flotsam and jetsam of government, I think, but thank you very much to my panel. In a moment, you will be hearing the latest State of the Nation Tory leadership interview. Today, it's with former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick. Find out the answer to this question in a moment.
We can and should decarbonise our economy over time. But we
should we? Do you really care?
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
A new exhibition at Gainsborough's house in Sudbury in Suffolk is the first to chart the artistic careers of Cedric Morris, who lived from 1889 to 1982, and Arthur Let Haynes, who lived from 1894 to 1978. They were partners in love and art for 60 years. I'm joined now by the exhibition curator, Dr. Pat Hardy. Some people will not be in the least bit familiar with these two British artists. So do you want to say a word of background about Cedric Morris and Arthur Let Haynes?
About 100 artworks were left in 2017 of Cedric Morris's works, and it was felt then that an exhibition to showcase that work would be very appealing to the public. Morris's flower paintings have had a lot of traction. They've become very popular commercially, and there's been more research done on them. So it was felt that it would be good to broaden out the flower painter aspects of Morris's work to showcase the portraits and the landscapes and protest paintings, which we now had in the collection. And it was also thought important that his partner, as you mentioned, for 60 years, Let Haynes, was also given some profile because he very much fell away into the shadows because he was promoting Morris's work and running the school, which was set up nearby, near Sudbury, near Gainsborough's house at Hadley, which was a very different type of art school. And a lot of people, both artists and locals, do remember it having been in operation and how wild it was and how bohemian they were. So it's felt to be a good story in personal terms, but also artistically, to try and place these two, particularly Morris, in the 20th century art world.
GB News, the People's Channel. Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m, followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain, followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens.
With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK.
We're ready to keep you up to date with what's happening every half an hour, every single day. Bulletins here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, and as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and we were talking about the Tory leadership race, and the male Moggs have zoomed in. John says whether or not Mr Jenrick or any other potential Conservative leader has the right answers is irrelevant. The vital question is, should he become leader and be fortunate enough to win the next election, will he guarantee to implement the right policies? It's a fair enough point. And Howard says, as a Conservative, I like Robert Jenrick, but I don't think he will make the last two for the members' ballot. There are too many one-nation Tories, and I don't think they will choose a more right-wing candidate. It's not a real choice for the members. Well, now it's time for the part of the programme you have all been waiting for, the latest edition of State of the Nation's interviews with the Tory leadership contenders. Today with former Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick. Well, Robert, thank you very much for joining me and to discuss your leadership campaign. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is your personal journey, because if we'd been sitting here a year ago, people would have thought you were a good party man, a competent minister, but not particularly ideological. You resigned from the government over the immigration figures last year, and there seems to be a new, and to my view, improved Robert. and there's a great quote, I thought I'd read you from Keith Joseph, who said, "It was only in April 1974 that I was converted to conservatism. I had thought I was a Conservative, but now that I see that I was not one at all." Is this the sort of thing you could say?
Well, I think I'll be honest with you. I've been in Parliament for 10 years, and for much of that time, I thought our politics basically worked, and I tried to work within it. And I prided myself on being a good constituency MP, working hard as a minister, trying to get things done. And as Housing Secretary, I worked to get the number of homes being built in our country up to the highest level in 40 years. I tried to slash red tape for small businesses. I created a homelessness programme that was well regarded around the world. But over time, you're right to say, particularly in recent years, I came to view the British state as essentially not working for the British people. I did see that as Community Secretary during the pandemic, where the state was simultaneously overbearing and yet powerless. I saw it as Housing Secretary, where we had a planning system that meant that we couldn't build things like nuclear power stations or roads and railways, even when it was overwhelmingly in the national interest. But it was at the Home Office that my perspective changed the most. And I saw that the most basic duty of the British state to keep us safe and to protect our borders was being failed on a daily basis. And I saw there was a failed economic model of mass migration, where hundreds of thousands of people were coming into our country, placing enormous pressure on housing, public services, community cohesion. It was diminishing public trust. And I took the view over time that the British political system was not only failing, but was fundamentally broken. And that I had been a part of it, I had tried to uphold it, and it was actually contributing to our national decline. And so in a sense there is a parallel to the Britain of the 1970s, although the issues are very different, and to the journey of Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher and others around him. I feel now that we need to grip this country and arrest that decline, and to come forward with the serious answers to the serious challenges that our country faces.
And part of the problem, it seems to me, is the powerlessness of government. It's not so much a bad civil service, though there are issues with the civil service. It's that civil servants say, Minister, you can't do this because of, and that may be the Equality Act, it may be the Human Rights Act, it may be the Refugee Convention, but there are things that Parliament has agreed to that the civil servants then tell us we can't do. How do you change that? Do you take us out of the ECHR, take us out of the Refugee Convention, repeal the Equality Act, so that you have Parliament and ministers once again making decisions?
Yes, I think we have to think deeply about why we failed to deliver. Because the real reason we lost the election was that we didn't deliver for the public on the central issues facing the country and the promises that you and I had stood for on the 2019 election. Immigration was one. So was how do we have a strong economy and strong public services like the NHS. And a part of that was that we were not able, even good ministers who were driven by a desire to change things, were not able to get things done. I think we need to reform the civil service, and you tried hard to reduce the size of it, bring people back to the office, make sure that the good people prosper and the bad managers are weeded out. But it's bigger than that. It's also this framework of laws that were created predominantly in the Blair era, and which when we first entered government in 2010, and I wasn't there at the time, we were too quick to accept as the new status quo. I think we need to use this enforced period in opposition to think very carefully about which of those should remain, which should be changed, and which should be scrapped altogether. And they're all superficially attractive because they speak to laudable goals like the Climate Change Act, the Equalities Act, the Human Rights Act. But together, I don't think they're working in the interest of the British public. And I could envisage some sort of Great Reform Act in which we change this framework and make ministers more powerful, more accountable ultimately to Parliament and the public, and more impactful. And lastly, I have come to the conclusion that in that programme of reform, we need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. I don't think it's reformable. I think that's a comfort blanket that some adopt, but I've spoken to my counterparts, or former counterparts, in Europe. This would be a project of years or decades, and it would be akin to David Cameron's attempt to renegotiate our relationship with the EU. It wouldn't succeed, and I don't think the public can wait. The public want us to take back control of our borders, to control and reduce migration, and all the other things, frankly, that the ECHR is now getting into, like net zero. And we've got to be honest with ourselves and the public, persuade them of the case to leave the ECHR, and to do it if we re-enter government in the future.
And does that mean leaving the Refugee Convention as well?
I don't think that's necessarily required. What I think you would have to do is ensure that having left the ECHR, we then pass legislation, I believe in the sovereignty of Parliament, which is very clear on what our position is on asylum. And as you know, as I argued this at the turn of the year, unfortunately my amendments were not accepted, but I made the argument that my vision is that if you come here illegally, for example on a small boat, you are detained, you are removed immediately, we end the merry-go-round of legal cases that is preventing us from doing that, and you're taken either back home if it's somewhere safe like Albania, and I signed the deal with Albania, or to a safe third country such as Rwanda or whatever we're able to put in place in the years to come. I think we would be able to do that if we were out of the ECHR, and that's what the public expect us to do.
And one of the other consequences of the Blair settlement is the dead hand on economic growth. You mention net zero, but it's not just that, it's the whole swathe of regulation that stops business getting on with doing things. But every time a minister tries to deregulate, there is a lobby group for the regulation. Whether it's for newts or badgers, it doesn't really matter. There is a powerful group. How do you overcome the resistance of Parliament when MPs get hundreds of emails saying, save the newts, save the badgers, and stop the deregulation that is needed?
I think it's ministers having a genuine sense of purpose and the courage to take these decisions, some of which may cause a ruckus in the moment, but which will be proven right over time. And each of the deregulatory steps that I took as a minister, there were always a lobby group who said, don't do it. But most of them, not all, but most of them have stood the test of time. So when I said to any pub or takeaway during lockdown, you can become, pub or restaurant, you can become a takeaway tomorrow, we did it. It helped to save thousands of businesses. When I said that any cafe or restaurant can create al fresco dining on the streets and pavements, it was hugely popular with members of the public, particularly the young. When I changed the use class orders so you could turn a hairdresser's into a shop or a cafe, and if it sat empty for months into a home, people said that would harm the high street. You couldn't curate high streets In fact, it's worked pretty well, and it's converted a lot of empty shops into better uses. So I think ministers need to have more courage of their convictions, be willing to obviously listen to the views of people who understand their sectors, but ultimately to make decisions and then be judged on the results in the months and years to come.
And net zero is the big anti-growth law that we have in this country. Our energy prices, our electricity prices double those of the United States. What do you do about that? Do you postpone the net zero commitment? Do you recognise that it's unrealistic? Do you go along with it as we've currently been doing? How do you approach that?
Well, I want us to take a very different energy policy to the one that we've had in recent times, and certainly the one that Ed Miliband is now going to pursue. We already see in just 55 days the steps that he's taking to damage the 200,000 jobs in the oil and gas industry, to waste £8 billion on Great British Energy, this energy company doesn't produce any energy. What I want us to do is to level with the public and to say we are only 1% of the world's emissions. There are no prizes for being the first country in the world to decarbonise. We can and should decarbonise our economy over time. But we should we? Do you really care? I think we should do, but I don't think we should be doing it faster than our competitors. And I certainly do not think we should be doing it on the backs of working people, households in this country, further deindustrialising our country. And as you know, remember that energy prices in the UK are already 4 or 5 times higher than the United States. They've risen 300% in the last 20 years. There's no wonder that we're losing our steel capacity, and in time, no doubt, we'll lose further industries if we don't grip this issue. So I would take a different approach to the one we've had in recent times and make it the stated aim of our energy policy to produce cheap and reliable energy in the UK. And if we can produce energy as close as possible to that of the United States in price, and of course there are big differences between the UK and the US in terms of our natural resources, but we must be trying to reduce energy prices as much as possible and to align them as closely as we can to our major competitors. That, I think, is the right approach. If we can do that, then we help households, we help working people, which should be what we as Conservatives are always trying to do, and above all, we help to get economic growth going again in our country.
And what about fracking? Would you include fracking within that policy remit?
Well, I voted for fracking shortly after I was elected. I represent a constituency in North Nottinghamshire where there were at the time fracking licences, and I advocated for fracking. I think it's difficult to see how we can get fracking going again in this country because investors understandably have moved away from the market thinking that there's too much political risk. But I'm not opposed to fracking. I think our energy is probably better placed right now in investing in new nuclear and ensuring that we bring forward nuclear power, particularly small nuclear reactors, as quickly as possible. And that would be my primary focus.
And that leads on to the issue of trust, that investors don't trust us. People don't trust politicians. Keir Starmer has said all sorts of things before the election that turned out to be untrue, particularly in relation to the economy. How do you restore trust?
Well, I think in 55 days, Keir Starmer has already begun to show his true colours. He is presenting a black hole in the public finances, but it's a black hole of his and Rachel Reeves' own creation. The £20 billion figure that he speaks of is comprised of a £10 billion a year payoff to the trade union paymasters and £8 billion that he's spending on Great British Energy, who seems to take inspiration from Robin Hood Energy, a ludicrous energy company created by my neighbouring Labour City Council in Nottingham that went bankrupt as a result of it. So they are taking political choices, and I think they're the wrong choices. I think they're selfish choices. And as a result of those choices, taxes are going to be raised this autumn on the middle classes in our country, on business, which is going to harm economic growth and investment in the UK, and vulnerable people like pensioners. 10 million pensioners are going to lose their winter fuel allowance purely to pay for these political choices of Keir Starmer.
Mass migration has led to a decrease in GDP per capita rather than increase. What would your target net migration figure be if you were to be Prime Minister?
Well, I've said that I would get Parliament to set a legal cap on migration in the tens of thousands or lower. That seems to me a sensible starting point. That's still a lot of people coming into our country, but it's a huge improvement from where we are today. And I hope would be a unifying policy, because remember, that was the policy of David Cameron and Nick Clegg not so long ago. So we can get back to that. But the difference between my policy and what happened in the recent past is that by having Parliament set that cap, it would mean the public would have confidence that it would actually happen this time. I don't pretend it would be plain sailing. It's a big change. We've lived through 25 years of mass migration. But my point is this: if mass migration was rocket fuel for our economy, those 25 years would have just been the greatest period of economic growth and productivity enhancement in our history. As you and I know, far from it. This has been a period of low economic growth and amongst the lowest productivity growth since the Industrial Revolution. So it isn't making our country rich. And in particular, as you rightly say, it is not making individual citizens of our country richer, which is what we as politicians should ultimately care about.
Robert, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
A bold interview from Robert Jenrick, but will it be enough to persuade the party to elect him as its leader? We'll be discussing the possibility in just a moment.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update brought to you from the Met Office. Friday, it's going to be a cool but sunny start to the last day of the week and a settled day more widely across the UK. As high pressure builds in from the south and west, that will boot low pressure out of the way. So after the rather unsettled day across parts of Scotland, it will slowly turn dry as we head into Friday. But still a few showers to come through this evening, particularly across the far north of Scotland, the Northern Isles in particular, where there's a brisk westerly breeze. Elsewhere, though, a settled and calm night to come. Clear skies across the board. The temperatures falling away lower than they did last night. We could be down to 3 or 4 degrees rurally. Many towns and cities in single figures. And as the sun comes up a little later at the moment, it will feel a little bit fresher when you step out on Friday morning. There could be some mist and fog around as well, particularly across parts of the West Country, rurally in Wales. Some areas around the Pennines as well could see some fog first thing. A few showers still across the west of Scotland, but it's particularly the northern areas of Scotland where there's a risk of some showers. They won't be as heavy as they will have been today, and they should ease as we head towards lunchtime and into the afternoon, as well as that as high pressure becomes more dominant, bringing many of us a fine day. And now I think the best of the sunshine for most of us will be through the morning. A bit more cloud will develop into the afternoon, but it will still feel warm enough in the sunshine with light winds quite widely. A slightly warmer day than today to come tomorrow. Highs of 24 or 25 degrees across south and eastern areas of England. Temperatures in the high teens, low 20s quite widely elsewhere. Now another fresh start to the day to come on Saturday, and then we start to see a risk of some thundery downpours across the south throughout Saturday lunchtime. There may just be a bit more cloud filling in, and I think very few of us will actually see these downpours, but there is a risk of some heavy showers across southern areas. Now that risk increases more across southern areas on Sunday and then more widely into Monday, but temperatures staying just above average.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, for a frank and honest discussion with those in power that cuts through the spin and gets to the heart of the issues shaping our nation.
You haven't confirmed that you want to stand as leader, but you haven't ruled it out either.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial. Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
I deliver the dose of reality Westminster needs. That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria DiPiero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. We've just shown you the latest of State of the Nation's interviews with the Tory leadership candidates. And the mail mogs have come in. Gerald says, Mr Jenrick appears to understand the chronic problem facing this country, that politicians merely take responsibility for decisions made by bureaucrats. And Austin says, I like him. He has right thinking, so he's in my top 2. However, does he have the clout to bring the party together? Well, my brilliant panel is still with me, my most intellectual panel, and I'm going to throw the first of those questions from Austin to Paul Goodman. He is right thinking, but does he have the clout to bring the party together?
well, we'll see. I thought that was a good interview for the following reasons. He told a story that appeared to offer the prospect of a hopeful ending. So he said there's a problem. Problem's the way the state works. He used to think he could make it work as a conventional politician. Now he doesn't. And he had some solutions in the form of his Great Reform Act. And he was able to identify what he thought had gone wrong. So although he was conventional and polished and professional, very well-rounded answers, there was actually some sort of substance to what he said. I should add at this point, I'll have a vote in the leadership election as you will, and I've not got a dog in the fight. I've not decided who to vote for. I think that the question for him and for all the candidates is whether they can carry conviction. I think the difficulty for Robert Jenrick is that the plan is very solid and it's well articulated, but he does look a bit like me and you, namely a conventional Conservative politician. And you just might want something that's a bit more unusual. And you could arguably get that in the form of Kemi Badenoch or Tom Tugendhat, the former soldier. But I have to say, I saw all 6 of them yesterday at a meeting. And once again, Robert Jenrick was, to my mind, the most impressive.
Nigel, from an opposition standpoint, what marks out of 10 would you give him? I'm not asking you to say, did you like what he said, but his performance, his presentation, is that a professional politician who you think Labour would have to take seriously?
Yes, I mean, he's very slick. I'd give him a 7 for that performance.
Well, that's quite generous. Well, where does he lose the 3 marks?
Well, he loses the 3 marks on some of the details. I think that he loses it on the 1% he talks about of our emissions. It's a misleading figure. I mean, CO2 emissions causing climate change are a cumulative thing, and by that scale, since 1850, we lie 4th as amongst global polluters below America, China and Russia. So I think that part's misleading. I don't understand where he's going to if he wants to stay in the Refugee Convention. I welcome it, but I don't see how he can put through immigration policies he's talking about and remain in the Refugee Convention at the same time.
Well, I suppose he could...
Those are the 3 points he's lost.
OK, those 3 points he's lost, but I suppose he could make it clear that the Refugee Convention is subject to domestic UK law, and he could re-establish the historic dualism in the British legal system, where international law couldn't have direct effect in the UK unless passed into law by Parliament.
Well, there's no point in the Refugee Convention, then, is there? I mean, we're back to the same problems that the UNHCR uses the Convention as the basis of what they do, and they're saying that our Illegal Migration Act is illegal.
But then they were trying to send people to Rwanda, so I wouldn't take them too seriously.
Well, they weren't sending people to Rwanda. Only people.
They sent people from Libya to Rwanda.
And the Congo, but they went voluntarily. There was a huge difference between the people they were sending there and the people we were going to send there compulsory.
The principle's very similar. But let's come back to the Tory.
They volunteered.
Yeah, but it's saying whether it's a safe place to go or not is the key.
That
seemed to be the key.
Which would be an argument that we don't know if the European Court of Human Rights might have said the same thing. That it was safe.
But to come back to the leadership. If you were a Conservative, do you have any idea who you would be backing at this stage? And what would be the issues that a rational Conservative should be most concerned about?
Well, I'm not a Conservative.
No, I know that, and our viewers know that.
Indeed, they do. I would have thought that Priti Patel might be the person who could unite the party, because what you need to do is bring left and right together.
And she has, which, Paul, you were talking about, she doesn't look like a central casting Tory politician.
This is probably the most difficult challenge for an opposition Conservative leader ever. It's not like you're simply facing Labour. At the next election, it's not absurd to suggest that the 4 parties in England could get 25% each. The Conservatives are facing a huge new challenge for reform, plus a Labour government, plus the Lib Dems eating away at their vote in the home counties, and have had a very difficult 13 years, partly for reasons that are their fault and partly for reasons that are not. This is a titanic challenge for whoever is fortunate or unfortunate enough to win.
And do you believe, which I think will be very important to Conservative voters, that Robert Jenrick's conversion Israel to Damascus experience is genuine?
I think what would matter most for voters simply is the what they got out of Thatcher and Blair, who they voted for in very substantial numbers, which are they're convinced that there's a plan that can work, that the leader will deliver. I think that matters, not so much what they thought in their past. After all, Margaret Thatcher was a very conventional member of the Heath government.
Well, and there's this wonderful
before she reinvented herself, and you went down that road with Jenrick in the interview when you mentioned Keith Joseph.
A wonderful quotation from him saying, I thought I was Conservative, but I never was until now. And then he became one. Does Keir Starmer, by abandoning half his promises, actually make it harder for everybody else? Does he damage trust in the whole of politics by the way he intimated he wouldn't raise taxes and now is intimating that he will raise taxes?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, he's saying he will raise taxes, but you're quite right. During the election, he intimated that the tax rises that were built in were as far as he needed to go. So I think that he's got to get over an issue of explaining that, or at least Rachel Reeves has. And then, of course, we didn't know anything about the winter fuel allowance being abolished during the election. Now, if Rachel Reeves needed that £1.5 billion this year urgently, I understand why she did what she did. The question is whether she'll go further now and start looking at the way we divvy up money to older people, which is terribly out of date.
But risks being very unpopular. Well, thank you to my most intellectual panel. In a moment, could Sir Keir Starmer be on the verge of breaking another of his promises of not increasing taxes on working people? Find out in a moment.
I'm Emily Carver. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently. It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it? It's explosive. I mean, this is very good. It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial. And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born. It's everything you need to kickstart your evening. Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it. That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Tom Harwood. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
The Princess of Wales could be back to full duties by the autumn. This would be wonderful news.
Well, I actually don't think she is going to be back to full-time duties by the autumn. I think that's how I read it. But in fact, I think what they were saying, this is a report by the Daily Mail's royal editor, Rebecca English, is that Catherine is still recovering and she's still having treatment, but she doubts whether she'll be back to full-time duties, but we will be seeing her. So we will be, seeing her at big royal events, and she'll, if she's up to it, she will, appear now and then. But most of her work will be done from home because she's still having the cancer treatment. And as she said way back in the summer, she has good days and she has bad days.
Yeah, and we can all understand that, can't we? But it does make such a difference, doesn't it, to catch glimpses of her and seeing her and William this week congratulating the GB athletes after the success at the Olympics. It really does make all the difference just to see her, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And I think, she wants to get out there, but I don't think she's going to be back at the daily chore of royal duties, visiting hospitals, things like that. I don't think she'd be strong enough to do that. But, I mean, she looks terrific. We know she's had a brutal year, in fact, probably much, much worse than any of us can imagine. And so she's, doing what her doctors are telling her. She's taking it very gently. I'm sure she wants to go full steam ahead, but she is being restrained, as it were.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Nana Akua. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It seems taxing the rich isn't enough for the Prime Minister. He has now set his sights on white van man. So Keir Starmer has indicated that there may be a rise in fuel duty in the upcoming budget. Motorists better start worrying, as although Starmer vowed not to raise taxes for working people, it seems he may be flip-flopping on yet another promise. He refused to dismiss a potential rise when asked about it during his recent visit to Berlin. Is Starmer going to sell out white van man to pay for higher wages for train drivers? Well, I'm joined now by the leader of the Climate Party, Ed Gamel. Ed, thank you very much for coming in.
Pleasure.
We have different views on the taxation of fuel, but we may have the same view on politicians sticking to their promises, that if he'd gone into the election saying, look, I think it's about time we put the accelerator back on fuel, I'd have nothing to complain about. But he didn't.
Definitely agree with you on that. Yes, politicians should stick to their promises. And we've had a big lack of trust over the previous years on people actually doing that. And that's probably been running not just for 5 or 10 years, but for 25, 35, 45 years. So that's very important. Having said that, he hasn't actually said he's doing it yet. We're still in the stage of speculation. We're also in the stage of looking at how much it might be, even if it did actually happen. And the amount of money being talked about, whether it's 5p or 10p. If it's 5p, it's simply putting back the money that Rishi Sunak took off in 2022 to help people, which there are allegations from the RAC and that actually that never went into the pockets of people anyway, and never helped them. It simply went there into the profits of the retailers. So first thing is we don't know he's going to do it. The second thing is we don't know how much. If it's 5p, it could be just taking away those profits from the retailers.
But any wholesale price will inevitably lead to a retail price, and that actually the wholesalers and the retailers were hit by all sorts of other increases in prices. So I think that 5p would have come through pretty smartly to consumers if it hadn't been taken off. But if you take the issue of fuel taxes, one of the things that really keeps the economy going is the activity of small businesses, the deliveries, the engineers who go out and so on, all of whom are dependent on fuel. This is the lifeblood of any economy. And is it right to increase taxes on the basic input until you've got cheap alternatives?
Cheap alternatives are on their way. And obviously, when we're talking
on their way, it's a key point.
Sure, they're on the well. They're in process. They're happening, etc. And when you look into the electricity system, that's very different to driving your car, of course, instantly. I mean, with cars at the moment, we're about 16% EVs at the moment, and it's going up. So the electricity system is kicking in and it's helping. But the electricity system itself, of course, is actually in the right track at the moment. Costs are coming down on the wholesale market and all that sort of thing. So there are opportunities for those now, and it will encourage the shift, of course, away from fossil fuel cars into EVs if it happens.
And the question there is, to what extent do you think it's justified to use the stick rather than the carrot?
I'm not sure it's being intended as a stick rather than a carrot. I mean, I think the excuse that's being used by Rachel Reeves, and I'm not Labour, so I'm not defending or condemning her, but is that there's a black hole of 20 billion and she needs to fill it, so she needs to find the money from somewhere. That's her reasoning for it. It's not stick and carrot. I'm very much somebody who thinks that we should be doing both. If you want to move something in a particular direction, you bring in both the stick and the carrot. Or, and we've talked about this before, you take a much broader approach. You take a whole economy approach. You drive the entire economy in a particular direction. You galvanise private investment to get behind it rather than using government money. And then you're away from sticks and carrots. You're simply in a whole system approach.
I'm very sympathetic to that. But the whole system approach isn't there yet. You think when we moved to petrol cars, we didn't need a government to tell people. It was cheaper, it was more convenient. I think if the new technologies are better than the internal combustion engine, then they will naturally evolve and be adopted, and therefore you don't need sticks and carrots. But this takes longer than perhaps you may be willing to accept.
Yes, I think looking at it economically, I think you want to do it fast and be ahead of the competition. I mean, we heard Robert Jenrick in your previous interview talking about, there's no points for winning the decarbonisation battle. I'm sorry, there are. Being ahead on every technological advance, being ahead on every system advance, innovating ahead of the rest of the world provides us with the rest of the world then as a market for all those innovations that we've created. So there is a massive prize for being ahead of the curve on decarbonisation and winning. And that feeds back into then the smaller discussion we started with, which is in terms of moving people over to EVs or other forms of transport.
The risk of that is if it's government-led, you adopt a technology that nobody else in the world uses. So you may have a brilliant technology that doesn't catch on, and that this may be what's at risk of happening, that who knows whether it will be EVs or hydrogen or whatever the end product will be. And if you put all your eggs in that basket and the government decides it, that is the biggest investment risk historically.
I think the government shouldn't decide it. I think what the government should do is set the direction. So the government takes the big elephants in the room. Let's set an earlier net zero target. I know you haven't been behind it, and I'm hoping I'll convince you over the years that you will get behind it. We take an earlier net zero target and we take the entire economy there. It's a system approach. And then we let the economy, the market, the investors and the businesses get at it. If you make them sure that we've got an earlier target, they'll do the work, and we then don't need to do sticks and carrots and minor policy adjustments.
Well, Ed, thank you very much. You're always welcome to come back to try and convert me, though it may be a Sisyphean task. Never mind. And finally, a brief mention of the Poulton Double Hill Second World War Memorial that's taking place this Saturday. It starts at 2 o'clock. I will be speaking, and it's the last one because the marvellous organiser, the great man, Peter Yates, is retiring. Please come along. It's actually technically in Farrington Gurney, but it's very near Poulton. Anyway, up next is Patrick Christie's. Patrick, what is on your bill of fare this evening?
Well, we've got a heck of a lot on, Jacob. It turns out that a huge chunk of this so-called economic black hole is down to massive overspending on illegal immigration. It also turns out that's set to get worse. So when your taxes go up, you know who's paying, who it's going to pay for. Keir Starmer, as well, as he emerging as a dangerous authoritarian with this smoking ban. Meghan Markle, she's now officially using the royal brand to line her own pockets. I think that's a bit rum. And the fire brigade, they are now being called out once every 4 hours to deal with fat people.
Oh, my goodness. Well, that's all very interesting. Coming after the weather, I'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. I'm going to be at Lord's tomorrow. I'm not heading down to Somerset, but I will be getting down to see God's Own County before the end of the weekend, where the sun will be shining, because I'll be at the Double Hills Memorial. I hope to see you there.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update brought to you from the Met Office. Friday, it's going to be a cool but sunny start to the last day of the week and a settled day more widely across the UK. As high pressure builds in from the south and west, that will boot low pressure out of the way. So after the rather unsettled day across parts of Scotland, it will slowly turn dry as we head into Friday. But still a few showers to come through this evening, particularly across the far north of Scotland, the Northern Isles in particular, where there's a brisk westerly breeze. Elsewhere, though, a settled and calm night to come. Clear skies across the board. The temperatures falling away lower than they did last night. We could be down to 3 or 4 degrees rurally. Many towns and cities in single figures. And as the sun comes up a little later at the moment, it will feel a little bit fresher when you step out on Friday morning. There could be some mist and fog around as well, particularly across parts of the West Country, rurally in Wales. Some areas around the Pennines as well could see some fog first thing. A few showers still across the west of Scotland, but it's particularly the northern areas of Scotland where there's a risk of some showers. They won't be as heavy as they will have been today, and they should ease as we head towards lunchtime and into the afternoon, as well as that as high pressure becomes more dominant, bringing many of us a fine day. And now I think the best of the sunshine for most of us will be through the morning. A bit more cloud will develop into the afternoon, but it will still feel warm enough in the sunshine with light winds quite widely. A slightly warmer day than today to come tomorrow. Highs of 24 or 25 degrees across south and eastern areas of England. Temperatures in the high teens, low 20s quite widely elsewhere. Now another fresh start to the day to come on Saturday, and then we start to see a risk of some thundery downpours across the south throughout Saturday lunchtime. There may just be a bit more cloud filling in, and I think very few of us will actually see these downpours, but there is a risk of some heavy showers across southern areas. Now that risk increases more across southern areas on Sunday and then more widely into Monday, but temperatures staying just above average.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
It's the final week to see how you can